And
Okay, so welcome to these sessions, and we have a great colleague, Dr. Sue Ollerhead, and she's going to share some of her research and the teaching strategies for using translanguaging in the classroom. Is one of the most popular buzzword at the moment. It's also one of the best idea that came out in the last 3 to 4 years. Okay, so it's a really new hot topic, and I would like to encourage everybody to not only take notes, but also try out some of the strategies that she's going to share later today. So without further ado, I'm just going to give the mic over to Sue. Okay.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. And thank you for joining me sort of late in the afternoon, early in the evening. I know it's a busy time for families. Certainly is a busy time in my household. So very, very pleased to have you joining me. I'm just going to share my screen so that we can get my presentation up and running. Alice, can you see that? Is that all good?
Yes, all good.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Perfect. I know that this is you've attended quite a few sessions already, and this is something maybe a little bit different in terms of traditional languages pedagogy, and I thought it might just be a nice opportunity to talk about the idea of translanguaging and what it means in the work that I do, but also to hear from you all about how it could be possibly useful in your teaching, in your various contexts. So this is really going to be a bit of an introduction to translanguaging, and also looking at a few strategies that I have used in my teaching and in my research, but bearing in mind that a lot of my teaching is done in an English as an additional language context. So we need to be able to apply this theory and this practice to your context. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how that could work. As Alice said, I work very closely with her at the School of Education at Macquarie University. And we're really, really excited to be working more closely with you. We see languages as a very valuable resource in our community, in our state, in our classrooms. And really, this is where translanguaging fits in. It's seeing the languages that students bring into the classroom as very, very valuable assets for their learning and for our teaching in the classroom. But it's always a little bit daunting. I mean, I'm sure you find it too in this new era of online teaching. I would so much rather be in a room with all of you and getting to know you. But in this new way of doing things, I feel that it's important for me to just get a little sense of who you are. I would love to know what languages you speak and what languages you teach. So if you could please just take a moment to type the name of the languages that you A, speak, and B, teach into the Zoom chat, that would be really, really great. Thank you. And I might have to ask Alice to report back to me because I only have one of my screens working. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to see everybody's contributions.
Okay, we have a running list, very exciting. Right. We got, let's start with, I saw Polish,
nice.
And then Vietnamese, Macedonian, Germans, Spanish, French, Greek, Arabic, Hindi, Indonesians, Vietnamese, okay, Armenian, Shihala, Italian, Mandarin, and Serbian, Japanese, Khmer, Arabic, Russian, Farsi, and I think the list go on and on. So I'll just have to report it later.
That's wonderful. That's so, it really sets the scene for our discussion, and I feel really privileged to be in the company of such a rich diversity of language speakers and language teachers. So again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Okay, I'm just trying to move this onwards. Liz, I seem to have a problem with moving the screen on. Do you know? I just want to move to the next screen.
Okay, I think that will have to be
Seems to have frozen for a second. Any idea why that would be?
It will be. Would you like to unshare that
Stop
screen
share.
and start again? Yeah.
Okay, and go in again. All right. The beauty of technology. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I guess it would be good for me to enter this discussion as well. My language repertoire, I guess, is more of the African variety. So I was born in South Africa and lived there for 30 years before I moved to Australia. So my repertoire of languages have a very African flavor. So I speak a bit of Zulu, isiXhosa, Afrikaans, English, and some very rusty French. But yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to meet all of you. Okay, are we back on screen view, Alice? So is that all okay?
It's all on you, so if you can just start sharing again.
Okay. Are we there?
Good.
Okay.
Good.
All right, we're back in business. Thank you. Okay, so the first sort of question that I have for you is just to get a sense of what you understand by translanguaging. And all you really need to do for this question is to write number 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat. If it's completely new to you, could you write number 1 in the chat? If you know a little bit about it, number 2, if you've tried it already in your classroom, write down 3. And if it's something that you do as a matter of course in your teaching, please put down number 4. Okay, and Alice, you might be able to help me out with the responses, because I don't have a good view of them.
We have the I would say just from a rough estimate, that is about 60% number 1.
Oh, okay.
That include me as well.
Okay, that's great. That's helpful.
Yeah, so there a good proportions of 2 and 3, and a small number of 4.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that's very helpful for me to know in order to sort of know where to go with the examples. Okay, we've just included a few sort of guidelines for our Zoom session, just so that you know. I probably should have said this earlier, sorry, but as Alice said earlier, for those of you who have just joined, if you could please just mute your audio, and if you like, keep your video switched off. You don't all have to, but it just helps a little bit with the transmission. We will be using shared Padlets in the breakout rooms. Please note that the video and the audio will be recorded and shared with participants who can't be here at this time. The chats and the Padlets will also be recorded, but they won't be shared. And your breakout conversations won't be recorded. I'm sure you probably know how it all works by now because you've gone through a few of these. Yeah, as far as the breakout rooms are concerned, you will be automatically assigned to a room with a small group. And before you go into the room, you'll use a link in the chat to open the Padlet links. When you go into your breakout rooms, it's really important that you unmute your audio and you switch on your video so that people can see who they're talking to. And when you type into the Padlet, it will be automatically saved. Again, you probably have done this already, so hopefully it's just second nature by now. Okay, so what I'd like to start off with is just, I guess, explain to you why translanguaging is part of the work that I do as an academic, as a researcher, as a teacher at Macquarie University. I'm then going to look at that whole idea of the home language in children's learning, because this is really where the idea of translanguaging comes in. How can we use the knowledge that children have from their home language to help them learn in other contexts? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a background to the research and what it says about that. And then the most important part is the strategies. What is translanguaging and how can we use it in the classroom? Please remember that you are the experts in your context. My background is as an English language teacher. So a lot of the work that I do around translanguaging is in mainstream classrooms where we are supporting students to maintain their home language, but also to use it to access content knowledge in English. In your situations where you're teaching that wonderful range of different languages, you are obviously teaching the target language and possibly using English to allow your students to access that language as well. So big suggestion I would give to you from this session is to really listen to the idea of translanguaging, listen to the kind of the foundation to it, and then see, well, what could this tell me about my teaching? How could this be applied in my context? There's no right or wrong answer, but I think as teachers, it really helps to stay aware of new trends, new ideas, new theories that are being used in education. So I'm hoping that this session will help you in that sense. Okay, so we know that we're in a very diverse country, that we have over 300 languages other than English spoken in Australia, and a lovely wide variety of languages, especially in New South Wales, where over 36% of students speak a language other than English. And we know that for our teachers in government schools, in mainstream schools, they are expected to understand the language needs of students who don't speak English as a first language and to accommodate those language needs in the classroom. But we do find, though, that a lot of our teachers find that very difficult, especially if they've grown up as monolingual speakers of English. They find it very difficult to understand, I guess, the multilingual nature or the multilingual resources that students bring with them to school. At the moment, we're working in a school where I think about 96% of the children in a kindergarten classroom speak other languages other than English as their first language. But at the moment, they come to school and all they speak is English. And what we find is that we don't really know what knowledge they're bringing to the classroom because they have only the vehicle of English to express what they know. And of course, when you're 5 or 6 and you've heard little English at home, it's very hard to express what you know through a language that you're still learning. So translanguaging really grounds itself in all these kinds of issues. And I think it might be useful to frame this discussion in terms of the role of the home language in children's school learning. why is it important? I mean, do we think that because Australia has English as a lingua franca that we should only get our students to speak English at school? Or is there a place, is there a role, is there a need for children to actually access their home language in the school? So I'm quite interested to know where you are in this idea. Do you think students should be able to use their home language in their classroom learning? And if so, why and how should they use it? I'd really like you to get into your breakout rooms and maybe have a little discussion with the people in your group. What is your thinking right now around the language resources that children bring to the learning context that they're in? And I understand that you will be managed into breakout rooms and you will have access to a Padlet to record your answers. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm just going to paste the first Padlet link. Could you please open that before you enter the breakout room?
So everybody has access to the chat and they just need to open the Padlet link first. Okay.
Okay, so the link will also be shared in the breakout room. I'm opening out the room. Please join your fellow participant for discussion.
Okay, are we back on the screen? Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Okay. All right. So thank you. That was really good to chat with my group around the way in which they use the first language in the classroom. And it was really, really interesting to me to hear from Jane, who said, look, she teaches Vietnamese and her students speak English at school. So the time in her classroom is the time for them to speak Vietnamese. So they don't speak much else in the classroom. But sorry, I've forgotten your name. Is it Ceci? So, was talking about in her Greek classroom, she has children that have very many different sort of levels of exposure to Greek, and some have, parents that speak different languages, and so it's not practical for her always to speak to them only in Greek, because it just goes, as she said, way over their heads. And I think that's probably a good principle for us as language teachers. The whole idea of pushing your students, but not pushing them to the extent where they're completely at sea, and where you might be speaking Greek to them, or you might be speaking Hindi or Afrikaans or whatever language it is, but it's at a level that is so beyond where they're able to reach that it actually doesn't resonate with them at all. And we go back to second language acquisition theory, and we talk about that whole concept of comprehensible input. As Stephen Krashen said, that if we aim the level of language for our students just one level above where they currently are, then they can actually attain and acquire that language and use it for learning. But if we pitch it at a level too high, they're actually going to become demotivated and zone out and disengage. So you as language teachers are the best place to know where your students are in terms of their language level. I always say to my student teachers that you are the best differentiators in the whole school, because you know how important it is to find out what students know before you can teach them effectively. And I think that's a really, really good principle. Just going back to this idea of the role of the first language in helping students to learn, I think it's quite important just to go back to tried and tested theory and what scientists, psychologists, developmentalists have found out about the way children develop language. And Fred Genesee, who's an educational psychologist who's written a lot about bilingual or multilingual children, has said it's really important to remember that children's second language practices only emerge in interrelationship with their current language practices. So they really need to move from something they know to something they don't know. It's again that idea of not throwing them in at the deep end, because they need to actually hook the new language onto something that they know. And we know that in situations in Australian classrooms where children from language backgrounds other than English enter school with not a lot of English language proficiency, need to still be supported in their home language at school so they can develop that literacy fully and build their English language literacy on their home language literacy. It's a very important educational concept. And that whole idea relates to the whole idea of first language, second language transfer. Jim Cummins, who's a very well-known researcher, says that a language learner is a bit like an iceberg. And we all know how deceptive icebergs are. We can just see the little bit of ice sticking up above the surface of the water. But of course, what's underneath the water is very significant and very sizable. And he says that there is a common basis that connects the first language proficiency and the second language proficiency. And that common basis is that their cognitive understanding. So if we want to teach our students effectively, we need to be able to allow them to access what they know in their first language so that they can apply it to the second language. Take, for example, the child who enters an English-speaking classroom at the age of 8, and he's come from, say, for example, he's come from an African country. I'm from Africa, so what if he's come from Zimbabwe and he knows really well how to tell the time in his home language, in Shona. He understands the concept of time, he can count, he can work out, differences in time. But when he comes to the maths classroom in English, he can't, because he can't actually perform those calculations in English because his knowledge isn't coded in English. So what we're saying is it's important to allow students the time and the space to be able to access that knowledge in their first language so that they can transfer it to their second language. And I guess the third thing to just go through here is to remind ourselves, depending on what age group you're teaching, but actually it applies to most kids. We often talk about children just being like little sponges. And, if they don't understand the language, it doesn't matter. Just drop them in the middle of the classroom. They'll hear the language, they'll get exposed to it, and they'll just absorb it. Well, I'm not sure if you remember what it was like when you were at school, but I know that it can be very daunting for students to adapt to a new environment. I remember moving schools often when I was a child. And so our students often don't show what they know because they're daunted at having to produce new language in a language that they don't understand. So remember that providing a bridge to the first language can be a very effective way of making children feel at home in the classroom and engaged in their learning. Now, again, some of you might think, well, this isn't really relevant to my teaching because all I need to do is to teach my children about the target language and the vocabulary they need and the grammar they need. That's fine, but remember, we have to engage children, and the best way to engage them is to make a bridge from what they know to what they don't know. So sometimes using a little bit of their home language or making space for them to use their home language can be a very valuable and comforting and enabling thing for them. Okay, so we know that in an ideal world, we would have bilingual programs for every child who could develop their first language and develop English at the same time. Like a Canadian situation, or as in some schools in the United States where there's Spanish and English bilingual programs. But unfortunately, that's just not possible in Australia when there are over 300 different languages other than English spoken. So we find that a good way of supporting students to continue to develop their home languages in the classroom is through something that we call pedagogical translanguaging. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm hoping that we can just talk around it tonight and get some idea of what we're really talking about, because in fact, it is the most natural thing in the world and it plays out in multilingual contexts around the world. So what is translanguaging and how can we use it? Well, the well-known bilingual researcher Colin Baker says that translanguaging is simply the process of making meaning, shaping experiences, gaining understanding and knowledge through the use of two or more languages. So to put it simply, it's a process where multilingual speakers use all of their languages as an integrated system to communicate, whether for asking questions, providing answers, or participating in any other form of communication in the classroom. The best way we can understand this, I guess, is as multilingual speakers ourselves. And I know I'm in good company here because I know you're all multilingual speakers of other languages yourselves. And if I think of my own experiences growing up as an English-speaking South African, but in a country where there are 11 official languages. And I've lived in Australia for 13 years now, but I still... it still absolutely thrills me when I go back to South Africa, which I try to do very often, and I hear specific words that I know I would only hear in South Africa, words that have a specific resonance or a specific meaning in the South African context. Now, I wonder if you can think of the same thing in your home languages. The last time I flew back to South Africa, I was waiting to pick up my luggage at the carousel, and I heard different fragments of speech. And I guess as a language researcher, I always record different fragments of speech because I find them so interesting. And I heard these three conversations, or these snatches of conversation, while I was waiting for my suitcase to come through the carousel. And I heard, lost my age, you see what I have to deal with, Haibo. And then I heard, Haketsebe, every day more, so I must put up with this. And then I heard, shame, sisi ukatelena. Now, as I sat there, I realized that I was listening to natural translanguaging. I was listening to three languages, sometimes two, being mixed together in the same sentence. Why were they being mixed? Because there are just some words in South African languages that are just more expressive than others. And because we've got so many languages at our fingertips, we can mix them at ease, and it just becomes part of our repertoire. So I wonder if you can think about the languages that you speak. When do you use these languages and in what circumstances? Do you ever mix your languages like I do? And if so, in what ways? And do you notice your students doing that? And if so, in what ways? So I wonder, Alice, if you could put us back in our our breakout rooms, that would be really good. And we can just have a short, I think maybe just 4 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So could you please open the Padlet link before you go into the breakout rooms? And the rooms are now opened.
Okay, so this will just be a quick one.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? I'm going to
Yes.
a new sharing because it's not moving. Oh dear. Okay, let me try and share my screen again. I think that might be better.
Oh, much better.
Okay, where were we? All right, so can everybody see my screen that talks about 2 types of translanguaging?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. So we're talking about 2 different ways of mixing languages. The one is what we call contingent, which just means often when I talk about translanguaging, people say, oh, well, I do this in the class all the time. I allow my students to mix their languages. And that is a type of translanguaging. But what we're talking about here is planned translanguaging, where the teacher actually designs the use of multiple languages into a lesson plan or into a unit of work. And that's really comes about as a result of knowing where your students are in terms of their language level of language learning, and knowing how much of the target language that they can access, and knowing how much they need their first language to be able to access the target language. So the purpose is really to support their learning, to design in opportunities to use their first language. So I'm going to look at a few strategies that I have researched with multilingual students in a number of different contexts. But please remember that I work in a slightly different context to the ones that you work in. In the schools that I work in, many of them are intensive English centers where students come with a variety of language resources, and they're trying to equip themselves for getting ready to enter mainstream school. But I'd like you to listen to some of these strategies and tell me what you think in terms of how it resonates with you, how you might possibly use them, or whether you think that these just don't apply to your context. I'd be interested to have your feedback. So I think the best place to start when we're deciding how much of students' first language to make space for in our teaching is to consider the content of what we're teaching. Say, for example, you're teaching a lesson on hobbies and you've got a lovely text that you want them to interact with. First, we need to think of the students that we have, and we need to think, are there aspects of this text or this content that our students might not be able to access? And I've said here, remember, BICS versus CULP. What I mean there is we need to distinguish between the everyday communicative language that our students talk to each other from the underlying cognitive knowledge that they need to access to be able to do their schoolwork. So if there are aspects of the text that you think our students might struggle with, then we need to use translanguaging to set them up to succeed. If you say no, they'll all be able to manage this text, which is quite unusual, but if you say no, they're all fine with this content, I'd like you to think again, because remember, there are always cultural aspects, identity aspects, local knowledge aspects of text that might not be accessible to all of our students. So remember, translanguaging is not just about the language itself, but the culture of the language. And this is where you are all experts. And I want to give you an example. As a teacher educator, I spend a lot of time in different classrooms around New South Wales. And one of the, a few years ago, I was sitting at the back of a classroom and I was assessing a student teacher. And the supervising teacher was giving a short introduction, and he was talking about, it was a science lesson, and he was talking about modern Australian inventions. And he was talking about all the wonderful things that Australia has contributed to the world. For example, the black box flight recorder, Google Maps, the cochlear implant. I'm sure you can think of many more. One that's, I don't know where we would be without now is Wi-Fi. But in that class, it was quite fascinating because it was a very culturally diverse class. And another, a 14-year-old boy put his hand up and he said, "Sir, have you heard about some of the amazing African inventions that have come out of where I'm from?" And to his credit, the teacher said, "No, tell me about them." And this boy went on to talk about things like the charging shoe, which actually was invented by a young boy in Kenya in 2012, which actually used a crystal chip to insert into the sole of a running shoe. And when you walk, the friction that you make when you walk actually creates kinetic energy. So when you get to your destination, you can use that crystal chip to charge a mobile phone. And that's actually quite a genius invention, which changes people's lives. Now, the teacher hadn't planned for that cultural exchange, but he allowed space for it. And the lesson was all the richer from that exchange. And so this is what we're talking about. As languages teachers, we have amazing opportunities to allow our students to share that cultural knowledge that they bring to the classroom and help them to connect that to the target language. So again, we're breaking out. Can you talk about how you share the cultural elements of your teaching language, so the target language that you teach, with the rest of the class? And what opportunities do you create for your students to share their culture with the rest of the class? Is it a very one-way transfer of culture that we're doing, where we're saying, I'm the teacher and I'm going to teach you about the culture of the target language? Or are you inviting your students to bring their cultural knowledge to bear on the target language? Again, let's make this a short discussion, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. It would be great to hear your ideas. It's so important. It's such an important part of what we do.
We can't hear you. So your microphone isn't.
Oh, you can hear me, but I can't move my screen. Sorry.
That's okay.
It's just the joys of technology.
We all learning.
Okay. Right, let's go back there. And right, I just want to take you through, oh, come on. Alice?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm struggling to get back onto my screen. I'm not sure why. I'm getting stuck on. So I want to share this screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. Can you see the fairy tale screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. I'm not even going to go into slideshow because it takes me back to the other one. So sorry about that. I just want us to think about, we had some lovely chats in our breakout room about, although you're teaching a target language that is common, obviously the students in your classrooms come from different backgrounds. So they bring different cultural elements to the target language. And sometimes with our younger learners, a really rich way to explore these differences is possibly to look at things like fairy tales that are told in many different languages and how different aspects of the story are emphasized in different languages. So, and a good example is the age-old story of Cinderella and how the story really differs from, you know, the Mandarin, the Hindi, the Egyptian version, and how fascinating that can be for children to take a story that's part of their growing up and actually to compare different elements amongst themselves. That can be a really, really good exercise in intercultural understanding and the different way languages are used. Another example for our older learners is to look at possibly different factual stories. So for example, I've got a son who's mad about soccer or about football, and a good way of looking at how different languages make meaning of the same events was actually looking at the World Cup 2014 football match report, where poor old Brazil was beaten 7-0 by Germany. And of course, you compare the Portuguese news report with the German news report and how different the vocabulary was, how different the mood was, the different language. So getting students to realize that meanings are coded in different languages and how different cultures, how different historical views on things can actually shape the way we interact with language. Another way of looking at translanguaging is possibly to look at it in terms of a cycle of learning and teaching. So, for example, you might... Yes. Oh, sorry, I thought someone was asking a question. For example, you might get your students to read in their dominant language. So you might get them to read, if you're teaching English-speaking students, you might get them to read a text in English. But then you could get them to, depending on their level of literacy in the target language, get them to use something like a graphic organizer to take notes in the target language. So if they're studying German or Japanese or Chinese, to get them to make notes in the target language and then use those notes to write in the target language. So we don't have to do all aspects of our learning and teaching in the target language. We can enable access to their home language to help to support their acquisition of the second language. Of course, a very important, oh dear, if I go to slideshow, it takes me back. A very important aspect of this multilingual approach to teaching is to have what we call a translanguaging stance, where schools are seen as language-friendly places. Now, I know for those of you as community language teachers, you are very good at this. By making school environments feel language-friendly, by encouraging the use of different languages being spoken. But remember, there's some children who come to mainstream schools in Australia and they leave their home language at home or outside the classroom door, and they never get to share any of those cultural linguistic aspects of their identity at school. Community language schools are a fantastic space to allow for that translanguaging stance, to encourage that exchange of languages and cultures, which you are all doing so beautifully. I think what I'd like to move on to is just to share some strategies with you that some colleagues and I have developed. We actually did a project with the British Council where they asked us to develop a number of multilingual approaches for teaching in schools in Southeast Asia. So in fact, a lot of these strategies were trialed in Indian classrooms. And I'd like you just to have a look at some of them and think about this approach to teaching language. What do you make of it? The premise of these strategies was that we believe that teachers can help students build strong identities by acknowledging and respecting the language that they bring to the classroom. So for many classes, we believe that a really good way to start is to get students to find out what languages their peers speak. So to do a little bit of a survey in the first or second lesson to find out someone who speaks more than one language, who reads and writes more than one language, or who knows the same language as you. Doing these kinds of activities at the beginning of a cycle of teaching can be a really good way of setting a multilingual tone and a celebratory multilingual approach to teaching. So we'd really encourage that. We'd also encourage you to use multilingual resources, not just in terms of language lessons, but in terms of doing other schoolwork. So if they're doing a maths lesson, like learning how to make graphs or to tally numbers, use that opportunity to get them to find out who speaks what languages and who speaks more of one language than the other, et cetera, and in that way, seeing the language resources that are present in a classroom can be a very celebratory thing and a really positive thing to get students to realize that multilingualism is a rich resource for us. I found in my work with students in intensive English centers, a really good way of getting them to learn key English words was to get them to teach each other. So in a multilingual classroom, getting them to teach each other their home language word for a synonym for an English word. So they all became language experts in their home language, and they would teach each other a synonym for an English word that they had to learn. So we had the Spanish students teaching the word for emergency services, and we had the Greek students teaching the same word in their language, Mongolian, Chinese, Arabic, etc. That became a very dynamic way of students learning not just English, but learning lots of other words in other languages. And it really changes the engagement, the interaction in the classroom. Many of our students are surprised at the number of other languages that are present in Sydney. And when they actually walk around Sydney, or we went on an excursion, they were amazed to when they actually read this street signs everywhere, to see how absolutely diverse the names of shop windows, streets, etc., etc. There are many, many different languages represented visually in Sydney. And so getting students to take note of those can be a really good way, again, of celebrating multilingualism. And then also getting them to reflect on how certain aspects of language are familiar to them and certain aspects are unfamiliar to them. That can really help students to sort of express their cultural identity. We've spoken quite a lot around this whole idea of multilingual approaches. And I know it's probably a little bit early for you to form any opinion about what this means for your teaching, but I really do hope that if there's just one thing you take away from this session, that you reflect on the fact that Patsy Lightbound, who's written a lot about second language acquisition, she says the most valuable resource that students bring into the classroom is their home language. So it doesn't matter what context you're in. I think creating space for the home language, for the home culture, for opportunities to share, for students to share that with their fellow students is a really lovely way of moving towards more multicultural, more equitable education that will hopefully flow through to our mainstream schools. And so we believe that translanguaging enriches teaching and learning. It helps to support holistic development in the first language, the second language, in their academic content and their identity. And it also promotes a more sort of holistic view of the child, instead of just in terms of what they can perform. It actually gets them to express who they are and what history they bring with them, what stories they bring with them, what resources they bring with them to the classroom. And I think in that way, it can really make strides in improving the socio-emotional well-being of many of our students in the classroom. I think this is probably a good place to stop and take questions if there are any questions. But I would like to say that this is just the beginning of a conversation. I would love to be able to speak to every single one of you and find out, more about your teaching context and, how you feel about this idea of a multilingual approach to teaching. But I will leave you with the slides where I've actually done some writing around plurilingualism and multilingual approaches. There's a free link here that you can download of strategies for multilingual approaches. But if there are any questions that you'd like to be addressed now, I'd be happy to, or otherwise you can follow up at another time.
Okay, so I just want to point out that the resources will be available, including the PowerPoints and additional teaching and learning strategies to everybody at the end of the whole course. And we still got 2 more sessions coming. So thank you for your patience. And if you got questions, please type that in. And I'm just sharing the link to the Google form of attendance as well.
Okay.
Okay, so Rosemary just put down a comments that community language school a perfect place to support native speakers. The idea of translanguaging is a perfect way to validate further development of and support for community language schools. So that's from Rosemary Smith.
Lovely.
Yep. And from Teresa, is any suggested activities, and they will be available later on in the teaching and learning resource package available to participants. So that will be emailed to participant later on.
Thank you. It's lovely to read through all your comments. And thank you for your patience. Thank you for your patience with my screen sharing. I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but thanks for hanging in there. I just hope this is the beginning of a conversation, and that very soon we can be sharing these ideas in person and looking at how they play out in the classroom, because that's where all the magic happens. So yeah, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. And yeah, let's keep talking with each other, because it's really about what you do with the students and keeping them engaged, keeping them sharing, keeping them attending. So important to the health of our languages programs in New South Wales especially. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are we at the end of our program now?
Okay, so next, yes, we are at the end of the program. So Sue, could you stop sharing?
Sure.
Yeah, so thank you everybody. So next week we are going to take a look at assessment. So please stay on with Aggie, and she has a brilliant sessions on assessment and helping everybody to use assessment for learning and for teaching as well. So definitely hoping to see you next week.
Before I go, I just like to say thank you to Sue. I really like the idea how the student learning from each other and teaching the other. Say if the students speak more than one language, and then I like the idea. I probably will adapt that in my next teaching. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And I'd love to hear how it goes. So please, my email address is there. So please contact me. My best thing is hearing stories from the classroom. That's what really excites me. So please do let me know. Thank you. All right. Thanks. And thanks, Alice, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cảm ơn Sư. Kalinita.
Cảm ơn Sư.
Thank you, Alice.
Yasas. Yasu.
Cảm ơn Sư. Cảm ơn Sư and Alex. Okay, cảm ơn Sư và Alex.
Nkoska kulo, giabonga kakulo.
سپاسگزارم.
Bye, Danki.
Excuse me, what is the link? I can't find the link.
What link are you looking for?
Look for the attendance.
Yes, I just sent it in the chat.
Yeah.
Sorry, I want. Sorry.
Where is it?
Sorry, I want is a teacher today.
Yeah,
so
sorry, I'm looking for the link. But
PPT email give me. It's okay. So I want. Yeah, you are today the PPT give me. I'm on the look.
The PowerPoint will be available later to all the participants.